The road into Willow Creek was the kind that swallowed sound. Tall pines leaned over the gravel like watchmen, their branches scraping against the car windows as Annie Holloway tried to convince herself she hadn't made a mistake. Her husband, Caleb, drove silently beside her, jaw locked tight, eyes fixed on the horizon as if the town itself might rise up and drag them back. He hadn't said a word since they crossed the county line. He didn't have to. The air had changed, heavier, older, almost aware of them. Willow Creek wasn't on most maps anymore. A place people left but rarely returned to. Yet here they were, following the winding road to Caleb's childhood home after hearing his father was too sick to live alone. Annie had imagined a frail old man in a creaking farmhouse. But when Everett Holloway opened the door, he wasn't frail at all. His frame filled the doorway, his eyes sharp, shining with a familiarity that made Annie's stomach knot. He smiled, not kindly, not politely, but knowingly, as if he'd been waiting for her longer than Caleb had ever been alive. Inside, the house seemed to breathe around her. The wallpaper carried the scent of damp earth. The hallway floorboards groaned even when no one stepped on them. And at night, when the house settled into its own uneasy silence, Annie could swear she heard the soft thrum of a heartbeat behind the locked door at the end of the hall. Caleb brushed off her questions. "It's just storage," he said too quickly. "Forget it's there." But the town wouldn't let her forget. Faces stiffened when she mentioned the Holloways. Conversations died mid-sentence. The town nurse, a trembling woman with haunted eyes, squeezed Annie's wrist harder than necessary during a routine checkup. "If you feel something wrong, anything, you come straight to me," she whispered without explanation. By the time the pregnancy test turned positive, Annie no longer recognized the woman in the mirror. Her body felt foreign, as though something inside her was claiming territory it wasn't supposed to. Caleb stared at the test result with a horror he didn't bother to hide. "Annie, I haven't touched you in months," he said quietly, almost pleading, as if trying to convince himself as much as her. That night, Annie dreamed of Everett standing at the foot of her bed, whispering her name like a prayer he'd practiced his whole life. When she woke, her feet were dirty with soil, and the locked door at the end of the hall hung slightly open, swaying as though she just stepped through it. And somewhere deep inside her, the child she carried moved, not with the slow flutter of new life, but with the deliberate pulse of something that already knew exactly who it belonged to. When Annie and Caleb first drove into Willow Creek, the world around them felt as though it had slipped backward in time, settling into a slower, heavier rhythm that pressed against the windows of their car. The sun hung low through the canopy of pines, casting long shadows over the cracked road, and Annie couldn't shake the sense that they were entering a place that had been waiting for them rather than merely receiving them. Caleb's hands tightened on the steering wheel whenever the trees thinned just enough to reveal glimpses of the abandoned shacks and rusted mailboxes that lined the outskirts of town. He had described his hometown differently when they first met: quiet, rural, a little old-fashioned, but nothing that should have made his jaw clench the way it did now. Annie watched him closely, noticing how his eyes never lingered on any one house for too long, as if afraid of being recognized or, worse, remembered. The welcome sign to Willow Creek stood crooked on one rusted pole, the paint peeling and the letters faded into ghostly impressions. It didn't feel like a place people left because opportunities were elsewhere, it felt like a place people fled from. The stillness was unnatural, the sort that didn't simply come from isolation but from secrets layered over generations. Annie shifted in her seat, pulling her coat tighter even though the air wasn't cold. Each mile that brought them closer to the Holloway home seemed to thicken with a kind of expectation, as though the town itself exhaled only when they passed through. They drove past the church where Caleb had once sung in the children's choir, now sagging under its own weight. The gas station where he claimed he had bought his first soda was boarded up, its windows smashed, weeds sprouting through the concrete. It struck Annie that Caleb never mentioned why he hadn't returned in nearly 10 years, only that leaving had been necessary. He didn't share stories the way people usually did when revisiting their childhood towns. Instead, his silence deepened the closer they got, his restlessness growing more visible as he navigated familiar turns with the precision of muscle memory rather than comfort. When Everett's house finally appeared through the break in the trees, its silhouette rising like a lonely sentinel on the edge of a clearing, Annie felt something shift inside her. The Holloway residence wasn't just old, it seemed preserved, untouched by time in a way that felt intentional. The porch light flickered even though it was still daylight, and the curtains in the upstairs window moved without any wind. Caleb inhaled shakily as they parked, and Annie realized that this return wasn't a visit born out of concern for an aging parent but an obligation he had spent years trying not to confront, making her wonder what waited behind the front door and why Caleb seemed more like someone being pulled home rather than someone choosing to come back. From the moment Annie stepped out of the car and onto the cracked dirt of Willow Creek, she could sense an invisible barrier between the Holloway family and the rest of the town. It wasn't something spoken outright, nor was it marked by hostile stares or whispered gossip that carried down the street. Instead, it lived in the subtle ways people avoided eye contact, in the way conversations shifted the moment Caleb introduced her as his wife, and in the uncomfortable tightness that stretched across a person's face whenever the Holloway name slipped into the air. Annie noticed it first at the small grocery store on their second morning in town. A woman stocking canned goods greeted them politely enough, but the second Caleb mentioned he was Everett Holloway's son, her hands froze mid-movement. Her eyes flicked toward Annie, then toward the front door as if searching for an exit, and she simply nodded without another word. When Annie tried asking her about local recommendations for fresh produce, the woman pretended not to hear, walking away with a stiffness that felt almost rehearsed. The same thing happened at the diner, where the smell of fried catfish drifted through the warm air and the same three elderly men seemed to occupy the same booth every time they passed by. Annie, attempting friendliness, made a comment about the town's charm. One of the men chuckled until Caleb introduced himself, then the chuckle dissolved, replaced by a silence so abrupt it felt like a dropped curtain. The waitress who'd been ready to refill their coffee stopped mid-pour, nodding at Caleb without making eye contact, and hurried off without taking their order. Annie watched the exchange play out repeatedly, friendly faces dimming, welcoming gestures turning stiff, doors metaphorically closing the instant the word Holloway entered the conversation. What unnerved her most wasn't the avoidance, it was the fear behind it. Not fear of her or even of Caleb, but something larger, older, something that lived behind that last name. It was as if the townspeople carried a kind of collective memory, a burden they refused to acknowledge openly but couldn't shake off entirely. Caleb pretended not to notice, or perhaps he had spent so many years pretending that he no longer knew how to do anything else. He told Annie the town was simply wary of outsiders, but that didn't explain why they were perfectly warm to her until they learned who she married. One afternoon, Annie overheard two teachers whispering outside the post office as she approached. They didn't see her at first. One murmured, "Another one? Poor girl." The other hushed her quickly and pointed subtly toward Annie, who froze in place. When they turned and saw her, both women plastered on polite smiles that didn't reach their eyes before slipping past her with murmured apologies. Annie stood there feeling the weight of something she couldn't yet name, and she realized the silence surrounding the Holloways wasn't accidental. It was protective, maybe even self-preserving, as if the entire town had learned the hard way what happened when people asked too many questions about the family she had just married into. Everett Holloway's greeting stayed with Annie long after they crossed the threshold of the old house. She had expected an elderly man weakened by illness, someone grateful for company or at least relieved to see his son after so many years. Instead, Everett opened the door with unsettling alertness, standing tall despite the cane leaning against the wall behind him. His eyes were the first thing she noticed, sharp, searching, and strangely bright, as if he were studying her rather than welcoming her. The smile that stretched across his face didn't offer warmth. It was too deliberate, too knowing, the kind that made the air thicken with discomfort. Annie felt an involuntary shiver crawl up her spine as he reached out to touch her shoulder, his fingers lingering just a beat too long. Caleb didn't seem to notice, but Everett did, and the faint tightening of his smile made Annie wonder whether he enjoyed her unease. Inside the house, Everett moved with a confidence that didn't match the story Caleb had told her about a father too sick to live alone. His steps were slow but steady, his voice strong, his presence too commanding for someone supposedly on the brink of frailty. Annie tried to ignore the tension twisting in her stomach, telling herself first impressions could be misleading. But Everett kept watching her, even when he pretended not to. At dinner, she felt his gaze drift to her whenever Caleb looked away, a silent weight that pressed between her shoulder blades. He asked her questions in a voice smoothed by politeness, Yet each one felt laced with an underlying curiosity. She didn't understand where she was from, what her family was like, whether anyone would miss her terribly back home. Annie answered cautiously, forcing a smile, but Everett's expression suggested he was listening for things she didn't say. There was something unnerving in the way he interacted with Caleb as well. Caleb spoke to his father with the stiff, formal tone of someone addressing an authority figure rather than a parent. Everett rarely looked directly at his son, as though Caleb were a piece of furniture that occasionally made noise. But his attention returned to Annie again and again, tracking her movements with an intensity she felt even when she couldn't see him. Once, she caught her reflection in the kitchen window and saw Everett standing just behind her in the doorway, silently observing her without announcing his presence. When night finally fell and they retreated to the room Caleb had grown up in, Annie lay awake listening to the creaks and shifts of the old house. She told herself she was overreacting, that meeting a new family could feel strange. But when she remembered Everett's smile, too familiar, too expectant, she felt a cold certainty settle inside her. Whatever waited in this house, Everett had known she was coming long before she ever stepped foot in Willow Creek, and that knowledge made her feel less like a guest and more like someone who had arrived exactly where she was meant to be. Annie first noticed the locked room on her second night in the Holloway house, though she wasn't entirely sure she had meant to. The hallway at the top of the stairs stretched longer at night than it did during the day, the shadows pooling in its corners like something alive. She had woken from a restless sleep, convinced she heard someone pacing slowly outside their bedroom door. When she gathered the courage to look, the hallway was empty, yet the faint echo of footsteps still vibrated in the air. Drawn by a mix of curiosity and unease, she stepped barefoot onto the cold wooden floor and followed the sound she thought she had heard. That was when she saw the door. It was different from the others, its wood darker, heavier, reinforced with a steel latch that looked newer than the rest of the house. 3 locks held it shut, 2 old brass ones tarnished with age, and 1 modern padlock that glinted under the dim hallway light. There were scratch marks near the keyhole, not deep enough to suggest a struggle but jagged and desperate in their pattern. Annie leaned in closer, and that was when she heard it, a whisper. Soft, rhythmic, almost too faint to distinguish. It didn't sound like a voice so much as a breath trying to form words. She froze, listening. For a moment the whisper grew clearer, brushing against her ear like a gust of wind that wasn't there, and then it disappeared entirely, leaving only silence. The next morning, Annie mentioned the door casually over breakfast, masking her apprehension with a light tone. Caleb stiffened immediately, his fork pausing halfway to his mouth. Everett didn't look up at all, he simply continued cutting his food with slow, deliberate strokes. Caleb quickly told her it was an old storage room filled with junk, locked because the floorboards inside were unstable. It was the kind of answer that was meant to end the conversation, yet the way he delivered it, too fast, too rehearsed, made her even more suspicious. Everett finally spoke then, his voice low and oddly measured, saying only that certain doors in old homes were better left closed. Annie felt the air thicken as he said it, as though the house itself agreed. Despite their warnings, Annie couldn't stop thinking about the room. At odd moments throughout the day she caught herself glancing toward the staircase, listening for the faint whisper she had heard before. Sometimes, when she passed the hallway's edge, she sensed a cool draft slipping through even though the door beneath it was sealed tight. At night the feeling intensified. She would lie awake, staring at the crack of light beneath her door, half expecting to see shadows shift across it. The locked room felt less like a place meant to store forgotten things and more like a boundary meant to contain something deliberately hidden. And deep down, Annie sensed that whatever lingered behind that door was not dormant but waiting, aware of her presence, and growing restless in the stillness of the Holloway house. Annie met the town nurse by chance, though afterward she wondered if anything in Willow Creek truly happened by accident. It was a warm afternoon when she walked to the small clinic to pick up cold medication for Caleb, who had been restless and irritable since their arrival. The clinic itself felt strangely outdated, its walls lined with faded posters about childhood illnesses from decades earlier, and a faint smell of antiseptic clung to the air. Annie waited quietly, flipping through an old magazine, until a shadow fell across her. When she looked up, the nurse stood there, a thin woman with tired eyes and hands that trembled just slightly as she held a clipboard. The nurse introduced herself as Marlene, though the name didn't seem to matter. What mattered was the way she looked at Annie, not with the polite curiosity of a medical professional but with the wary intensity of someone recognizing a pattern she'd hoped never to see again. She invited Annie into a small examination room, insisting she check her blood pressure just to be sure, though Annie hadn't asked for anything of the sort. Inside, the room felt colder than the waiting area. Marlene closed the door quietly, as if afraid someone might overhear the nothing of a routine checkup. She asked Annie how long she and Caleb planned to stay in Willow Creek, whether she was sleeping well, whether anyone in the house had made her uncomfortable. Annie answered carefully, unsure why this stranger's concern felt both comforting and terrifying. When Marlene wrapped the cuff around Annie's arm, her hands shook harder. She leaned in close, her voice dropping to a whisper that barely carried across the small space. She asked Annie if she knew anything about the Holloway family history, the kind of question that made Annie sit up straight. Before Annie could respond, Marlene shook her head, as if already regretting asking. Then she said something that lodged itself into Annie's thoughts like a splinter. Women who married into the Holloway family often changed. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but slowly, in ways no doctor could explain. They became quieter, more withdrawn. They stopped visiting town. Some disappeared altogether, their absences brushed aside as though expected. Annie tried pressing for details, but Marlene refused to say more. Her eyes darted toward the door, the fear in them sharp and unmistakable. She told Annie that if anything felt wrong, anything at all, she should come to her immediately, no matter the hour. She squeezed Annie's hand in a gesture that felt more like a warning than reassurance, then ushered her out with forced calm. As Annie stepped back into the sunlight, she felt an unfamiliar weight settle in her chest. Marlene's words echoed in her mind, weaving themselves into the growing unease she had felt since entering the Holloway home. The nurse hadn't given her answers, but something in her trembling urgency made it clear there were things about the family Annie wasn't meant to know, things the town had learned to fear, and whatever happened to the Holloway women was not a coincidence. Annie found the Holloway family Bible on a quiet afternoon when rain pressed against the windows and the house felt heavier than usual. Caleb had gone into town for supplies, leaving her alone with the rhythmic dripping outside and the creaks of the old floors settling beneath her feet. She wandered into the parlor, a room steeped in the stale scent of dust and old wood, intending only to tidy a few shelves. As she moved a stack of yellowed newspapers aside, her hand brushed against something solid hidden beneath them. When she pulled it out, she expected an ordinary book, but the moment she felt the cracked leather cover and saw the embossed gold letters, she knew this wasn't just any Bible, it was a record, a family history bound in scripture. Curiosity tugged at her as she sank into the armchair by the window and opened it. The first pages were what she expected, dates of births, marriages, and deaths written in looping cursive. But as she flipped through more of it, a strange unease crept over her. Names had been crossed out, not neatly, but with thick, angry strokes that nearly tore the paper. Some entries had been erased entirely, leaving behind smudged shadows of letters she could barely decipher. Others were rewritten over and over again, as if someone had tried to force a version of events that didn't match the truth. In several places, the same name appeared on different branches of the family tree, looping back on itself like a knot tied too tightly. The deeper she went, the more unsettling the patterns became. Certain birth dates overlapped impossibly. Lines connecting family members twisted in ways that made no sense, as if the family tree was less a tree and more a tangled vine growing back into itself. One page in particular made her breath catch. It showed a list of Holloway sons, and beside each one was the name of a woman, yet many of the women's names were the same, repeated across generations, marked with annotations in Everett's familiar handwriting. Annie felt the hairs on her arms rise as she traced the ink with her finger, realizing these weren't simple clerical errors. They were deliberate revisions, attempts to control the narrative of who belonged to whom. As she continued reading, she found notes scribbled in margins, cryptic phrases like corrected lineage, preservation necessary, and the line must hold. Some entries had symbols instead of names, strange markings that looked older than the book itself. The last pages were the most disturbing, left almost entirely blank except for faint, newer ink that seemed to fade as she stared at it. Her own name was not written there, but she felt as though it should have been, as if the book was waiting for it. A sudden floorboard creaked behind her, though she hadn't heard anyone return. Annie snapped the Bible shut, her heart racing. The house felt different now, as if the walls themselves were aware she had uncovered something she wasn't meant to see. She placed the book back where she found it, but the tangled lineage lingered in her mind like a whispered warning, confirming what she had begun to fear, that the Holloway history wasn't simply unusual, but carefully curated by someone who believed the bloodline itself was worth rewriting. Annie realized something was wrong before she ever took the test, though she tried for days to convince herself otherwise. It began with subtle things, waking each morning with a heaviness in her limbs, drifting in and out of light-headed spells that made the walls tilt, and a strange sensitivity to the lingering scent of old wood that filled the Holloway house. At first, she blamed the stress of being in a place that seemed determined to unsettle her. She blamed the isolation, Caleb's growing tension, Everett's constant watchfulness. Anything but the possibility that her own body was changing in ways she did not yet understand. But the signs grew harder to ignore. She found herself waking in the middle of the night with a pulsing warmth low in her abdomen, a sensation that didn't feel natural, that didn't feel entirely her own. Her dreams became thick and vivid, filled with distorted images of the locked room at the end of the hall and silhouettes that whispered words she couldn't quite make out. The dreams left her with a lingering sense of being followed, as though something unseen lingered just behind her when she walked through the house. When she finally bought the test from the small pharmacy 2 towns over, choosing to drive the distance to avoid the scrutinizing eyes of Willow Creek, she waited until Caleb was out tending to errands before taking it. She sat on the edge of the bathtub, her heart beating so loudly she could hear it echo in her ears. She told herself it would be negative. It had to be. Caleb had been distant since their arrival, avoiding intimacy not out of lack of affection but out of an unspoken dread she didn't fully understand. Their last embrace felt like a lifetime ago. Yet when the result appeared, clear and undeniable, Annie felt a cold rush sweep through her. Pregnant. The word didn't bring joy or disbelief, only fear, sharp and immediate. She tried to reason through it, tried to control her thoughts, but all she could hear was Marlene's trembling voice warning her that Holloway women changed, that strange things happened to them without explanation. Caleb returned home early that day. When she told him, his face went pale, the blood draining from it so quickly it was as though he had known this moment was coming and dreaded it. He didn't comfort her. He didn't ask how she felt. Instead, he stepped backward, shaking his head, whispering to himself as though trying to piece together a puzzle he had spent his entire life avoiding. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked with something between panic and resignation as he insisted the child could not be his. A chill settled deep inside her, heavier than fear. Annie didn't know how to respond, but she could feel it, something growing within her, moving with purpose, as though the life forming inside her was not an accident but the fulfillment of something long set in motion, something that had been waiting for her long before she ever set foot in the Holloway house. When Annie told Caleb about the pregnancy, she expected confusion, perhaps even disbelief, but nothing could have prepared her for the raw terror that crossed his face. His body stiffened, his hands gripping the edge of the kitchen table so tightly that his knuckles turned white. For a moment, he simply stared at her, eyes wide and unblinking, as if trying to convince himself that the words she had spoken were a mistake, a trick of her mind. Then his voice came, low and fractured, each syllable trembling as he forced it out. It can't be yours," he said, and the words landed between them like a weight. He refused to explain, though Annie pressed him, her own voice rising in panic, demanding the reason, demanding to know how it could be true. Caleb only shook his head and turned away, muttering about things he could not say, about lines and histories, as if the air itself were tainted by the answer. Annie felt a growing sense of isolation in the house, as if the walls themselves had shifted in response to Caleb's fear. The familiar rooms no longer felt welcoming, the corners were darker, and every creak or sigh of the old house became a potential threat. Everett, for his part, observed in silence, never intervening, never offering comfort, but letting Annie's unease grow like a shadow around her. Every glance he cast seemed loaded with an unspoken knowledge, a certainty that she could neither name nor challenge. She began to notice the way the furniture had been arranged, the way certain objects were placed in deliberate positions, as though the house itself were anticipating her presence and the changes she carried within her. Sleep became impossible. Annie would lie awake for hours, listening to the old floors creak and the wind push against the shutters, feeling the weight of the child she carried with every breath. She noticed strange dreams taking root in her mind, dreams where the house extended into endless corridors, where doors opened to rooms that shouldn't exist, and shadows moved with a consciousness all their own. In these dreams, Caleb often appeared distant, a ghost of the man she thought she knew, leaving her alone to navigate the labyrinth of the Holloway home and the impossible knowledge that she could not yet comprehend. Marlene's warning echoed constantly in her mind, the nurse's trembling voice carrying a sense of urgency that now seemed prophetic. Women who married into the Holloway family changed, she had said, and Annie could feel that change beginning not just physically but in the tightening grip of fear, in the way she now perceived the house, the family, and even her own reflection. Every moment spent alone with Everett felt charged, as if the air itself conspired to remind her of her vulnerability. Annie realized she was no longer merely an observer in the Holloway household. She was a participant in something older and more calculated, and the life growing inside her was bound to a history that she could not escape, a truth Caleb refused to speak aloud, and a presence that waited silently for her to understand its claim. The revelation came slowly, in fragments and half-spoken truths, as if the town itself were afraid to speak too loudly. Annie had begun to notice the way certain neighbors and childhood friends of Caleb avoided her gaze, their smiles faltering whenever the Holloway name slipped from her lips. One evening, while walking back from the small general store, she encountered Sarah, a friend of Caleb's from his youth. Sarah's face was lined with worry, her hands wringing the strap of her worn bag as she stepped closer to Annie. She whispered in urgent, halting words that the Holloway family had always been different. That generations of women who married into the family had been monitored, controlled, and shaped by the men who ruled the household. Annie's stomach churned, and her pulse quickened as Sarah's voice lowered even further. She spoke of children born under strange circumstances, of unions orchestrated to maintain the purity of the family line, and of the older Holloway's influence over every birth, every marriage, and every secret hidden beneath the surface of Willow Creek. Annie struggled to process the weight of what she was hearing. It explained the fearful glances, the whispered warnings from Marlene, the silence of the townspeople, and Caleb's panicked reaction to her pregnancy. The patterns that had seemed coincidental, the crossed-out names in the Bible, the repetition of certain women's names, the impossible birth dates, suddenly fell into a horrifying order. The Holloways had been meticulously orchestrating the family line for decades, ensuring that each new generation remained connected in ways that defied natural expectations. Sarah's words painted a picture of control so complete that no woman who married in ever truly belonged to herself, and no child born under the family roof was free from the shadow of the patriarch. Sarah hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if the trees themselves were listening, and leaned in even closer. She told Annie that Everett had spent years carefully managing who married whom, how pregnancies unfolded, and which children were considered legitimate heirs to the family legacy. This manipulation wasn't random, it was deliberate, ingrained, a methodical preservation of a bloodline that the Holloways deemed sacred. Annie's thoughts swirled, connecting Caleb's refusal to acknowledge the pregnancy, Everett's knowing glances, and the locked room she had discovered days before. Each piece fell into place, revealing a terrifying picture. The child she carried was not an accident, and her presence in the Holloway house was not coincidental. As the wind stirred through the trees and the night crept in, Annie felt a cold, inescapable certainty settle in her chest. The truth was heavier than she could have imagined. The Holloway family line, maintained through careful manipulation and control, had claimed her, whether she wished to acknowledge it or not. Every reaction, every warning, every hidden glance in the town was a part of the same intricate web, a web designed to protect a secret older than anyone still living in Willow Creek, and the child growing within her was bound inexorably to it. The realization came to Annie slowly, almost imperceptibly, like the tide creeping over sand until it swallowed the shore. At first, it was the subtle, unnatural pull she felt at night, when sleep refused her and the house seemed to breathe in tandem with her own heartbeat. She began to wake in the darkness, drawn toward the locked room at the end of the hall, compelled by a force she couldn't name. Her feet moved on their own, brushing over the creaking floorboards as if guided by something older than reason. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the walls, and the familiar layout of the Holloway house seemed to bend around her, corridors lengthening, corners twisting into shapes that shouldn't exist. Each step toward the room intensified the sense that whatever was behind that door was not dormant but alive, aware of her presence, and waiting for her to understand. The baby inside her stirred differently now, with deliberate movements that were almost communicative, not random kicks or twitches. Annie began to notice a strange synchronicity between her dreams and the waking world, the soft murmur of voices behind closed doors, the creak of floorboards that seemed to respond to her thoughts, and the faint scent of earth and old wood that clung more strongly around the locked door. Caleb noticed too, though he could neither explain nor stop it. He would glance toward her with a mixture of fear and helplessness, a silent acknowledgement that the truth was far beyond what words could convey. The tension between them grew, heavy and unspoken, as if both were aware that the child she carried was entwined with a history neither of them could escape, a lineage that reached back decades and demanded recognition. Annie began to piece together fragments of conversations, observations, and warnings, the whispered words of Sarah, Marlene's trembling caution, the strange entries in the Holloway Bible, and realized they all pointed to the same horrifying conclusion. The locked room, the obsessive control of the family line, and Everett's unsettling presence were all parts of a single, deliberate design. Her pregnancy was not an anomaly but the continuation of something meticulously orchestrated, a claim placed upon her before she ever entered the house. The truth hit with the weight of inevitability. The child growing within her was tied not only to Caleb but to Everett, a living embodiment of the dark preservation that had defined the Holloway family for generations. Every instinct told Annie to flee, to resist, but the house seemed to resist her as well, walls pressing inward, shadows thickening, the air humming with expectation. Sleepwalking became a nightly ritual, guided by an invisible hand, and each step toward the locked room brought with it a mounting clarity. She understood at last that the child's origin could not be denied, that her body was no longer solely her own, and that the Holloway family's influence reached deeper than she had ever imagined. The realization was suffocating and absolute, leaving her alone in the quiet of the night to confront the inescapable truth. She had been drawn into a legacy that had been waiting for her from the moment she set foot in Willow Creek, and the life within her was the unmistakable proof of a dark, unbroken line.